different times, so I'm wondering what should I say, like good morning, good afternoon, good night. But so wherever you are and whatever time there it is, so hello to everybody, and I hope thank you for taking this time to be with us at your place in the world. Right. I don't know if I suppose everybody can see that we have a screen with lots of little icons there, so that we'll be able also to ask questions. And when we start officially, then I'll tell you a little bit more about the practicalities of using the icons and how we can communicate in the chat with the speakers and with the participants. Okay, what do you think? Good, yeah, so I just got a thumb up from Kea, so I would like very officially now to open this webinar and to welcome you all to the web seminar on racism, classism, and gender discrimination, intersectional feminist approach in strategy and analysis. First, on behalf of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and White Plus, as the organizers of this webinar, I would like to welcome you all. And thank you for joining us again from your places in the world and from whatever time you have there. Let me first just mention something about the organizers behind. There's the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, which is one of the oldest political foundations in Germany, and linking its work to the core ideas and values of social democracy, freedom, justice, and solidarity. It's a non-profit institution and works autonomously and independently. And then we have White Plus, which is European Feminist Network of women's rights advocates, gender specialists, women rights organizations, and development NGOs. White Plus focuses currently on migrant women's rights, intersectional feminist movement building, gender just trade policies, and feminist economic issues. For example, digital economy and many other related issues. My name is Jelena Langenhager. I'm at the board of White Switzerland, and I've been a member of White Plus from the start of its refoundation, and I'm very happy to be here as a moderator today. As I mentioned before we start with the introduction of the topic and of the speakers, let me just mention to you a few practicalities how we can best communicate in this webinar. On the panel below, you can see a small icon of the world globe. It's important for you because that's for the interpretation. If you click on this, you can choose the interpretation either in Spanish or in French, and you can mute the original audio. So if that's what you opt to, please test it to see how it works. For this webinar, we have 2 hours. And there will be speakers' contributions and hopefully also time to accommodate your questions in the discussion or a little bit later. Please, if you want to ask a question or if you have a comment on what you're listening to, first use the chat section, so the public chat section at the bottom of the panel in the chat. And you can also use that chat maybe to share some links on your work that is related to the topic of the webinar. That's really very welcome if we can share it here. I hope we'll have enough time to answer all the questions. If we can, we will try also maybe to facilitate some people who want to ask an important question live. And if you have a wish to do that, please indicate that in your chat, which means write really that you would like to post that question alive or so that we can see if we can find time for that. We will live stream this webinar as well on YouTube, and we will be making this webinar available afterwards. So don't worry if you need to listen to it again, so you will be able to do that. Another important thing is if maybe you want to remain anonymous when you ask your question, feel free to do that. Just for that, we suggest you rename yourself in anonymous or some other name than in your Zoom profile, so that it's clear that way. And the last but not the least, we are all committed to a civilized feminist exchange and interaction. As organizers, thus we reserve our right to exclude anyone who uses any offensive or discriminatory language or who abuses this space in undemocratic or anti-feminist way. So being practicalities sorted out, I would like to start with a topical part of web seminar on a very important topic. The aim of this seminar is to provide insights on how to integrate an intersectional lens in feminist activism and policy and gender mainstreaming. This web seminar is a part of a series of web seminars. One has been already, and there is one coming up, so I would like to mention it. You will hear about later as well. There is one coming up on the 30th of November, and that will be a web seminar with the topic Joint Strategies of LGBTQI* rights and feminism. So we warmly invite everybody also who is here today to join that seminar on the 30th November as well. Now, intersectional feminism helps us to see through and take action against all those patterns of gender discrimination in which multiple layers of power inequalities, which are tied to other aspects of people identities such as age, gendered expression, color of skin, sexual orientation or location, are all constantly reproducing multiple discriminations. And this web seminar will reflect how one intersectional approach can be built that connects anti-racism and gender equality with reducing economic inequality and precarity. And I also hope that we can also expand it to the other layers that you and the speakers and the participants in your work and insights can bring in to the topic. Now it's my honor to introduce our speakers today. I will introduce them by the alphabetic order of their last names, if that's okay with everybody. And that's why first I would like to welcome Eleonora Roldan Mendivil, who's today with us. Hello, Eleonora. Eleonora is a political scientist, educator, and journalist who is based in Germany. She's a doctoral candidate with the University of Kassel and is currently teaching at different universities. She works on racism, sexism, social origin and class, empowerment of marginalized communities, and historical education from the margins. Eleonora, we are very happy to have you with us. Then our second speaker, or second on my list of introductions, is Ruth Pion. Ruth, welcome. Ruth is an Afro-Caribbean activist and co-founder of the anti-racist and decolonial collective Junta de Prietas. She's also a social researcher in anthropology and gender, specialized in qualitative data collection and analysis. Through a decolonial and anti-racist approach and methodology, she researches the preservation of local resistant memories at Caribbean Institute for Decolonial Thought and Research. Ruth, welcome to the web seminar. Then we have with us Vashti Rebong. Welcome, Vashti, who is an intersectional trans feminist from the Philippines, who is an advocate for sexual and reproductive health, especially for trans and gender-expansive youth. Vashti currently leads the Forging Intersectional Feminist Futures at the International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific. We're happy to have you with us. Welcome, Vashti. And then I would like to welcome Farah Salka, who is a feminist activist based in Lebanon. She's the executive director of the anti-racism movement and works on organizing with migrant communities, asylum seekers, and mostly domestic workers. She works on issues of racism, discrimination, and labor rights. Farah, welcome to the webinar as a speaker as well. Good. Now, I would like to, let me just get my notes. I would like to open the first round of the questions, where the idea is that we have several rounds of questions, and I will ask one question that I will address to all the speakers so that all the speakers have a chance to share their answers, comments, or insights, if they want to, on that question. And I would like to start the very first one with a quote. And that quote is from Bell Hooks. And it's who is, for me, a very inspirational and important feminist, especially when it comes to intersectional approach to feminism. So Bell Hooks said, one of the ways that you can work for freedom is to change your mind and to move away from the space of binaries, of simplistic either's and or's, and to be able to look at the picture that offers us complexity. And that's exactly what my first question focuses on. It's how the intersectional approach tries to transcend the binaries or the categories and really looks at the complexity of the reality. Unfortunately, it's the reality with lots of discrimination and multiple layers of inequalities. But we would like you, dear speakers, to share with us your insights, the insights from your work as a researcher or as an activist, the insights that have become visible by looking at the complexity of the reality exactly through this intersectional lens. So what has come out of the intersectional lens really when you have used it in your methodology? I would like to first give the word to Eleonora. Eleonora, would you like to respond? Thank you.
Also, I want to acknowledge that as many of you, I have been battling a flu, so...
Eleonora, sorry to interrupt you. I can't really hear you very well. I don't know about other people. Could you just, yeah, Farah, you also, so we can't hear you very well. I'm sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, much better. Perfect.
Okay. The volume of my microphone was very low, so I just fixed that. Okay, so yeah, I will just give some of the insights that as someone who's researching on these questions, but also has been over a decade participating in different collectives, migrant self-organization in Germany, feminist collectives. What for me is interesting in this question is that there's this idea that there are no like universal narratives, right? That we cannot anymore like see things through a lens that universally is applicable to the world. I myself actually believe that there are universally applicable, and I will get to that in a bit. What do I mean with that? I'm not one of the people rejecting universalism just per se. The question that I put in this relation is
Eleonora, the sound is again a bit troubled.
I'm really sorry. It just went down. Okay. Yeah.
Good.
Okay, so I'll just take care. I think I just got somewhere with my finger. I'm sorry. So basically what I was saying is that for me, it is the interaction of the particularities of our lived experiences, right, in highly unequal and violent worlds that have to be connected to questions of universalities, such as that every human being should have shelter, should have enough to eat and drink, and of course should live free of violence of any sort. So for me, what I try to do in my research is to understand how we can bring this together. How can we cherish our particularities and at the same time look in the wider political horizon of working for liberation for all. So to my understanding and experience, as someone who has been, as I said, active in these multiple political spaces in Europe and South America, also as someone who's
Eleonora, the sound is off again.
I'm really sorry. I don't know why it's just going down the whole time. I'll just try to continue, and just to make it brief, I have a stopwatch here in order to check my time. So yeah, I'm just going to quickly go into what I feel is the difference between intersectionality on the one hand and intersectionality theory on the other. So that said, in that context, I believe that there's a big difference between this intersectionality as a concept, something historically developed by communist militants such as Trinidadian Claudia Jones in the 1950s and 1960s in the US and also UK, and also taken up by socialists such as the Combahee River Collective in Boston. This on the one hand, and on the other hand, intersectionality theory, as later on in the 80s pointed by...
The sound is off again, Eleanor, sorry.
I'm really sorry. I don't know what my Zoom is doing. I'll just try to continue, and I'm having my sound on check. So as I was saying, I think that there is a difference, and I want to quickly outline that difference. And in the other questions, I hope to be able to go a little deeper. So intersectionality as a concept in its most progressive form basically makes sure that experiences of inequality are seen as structural and not merely interpersonal bias. This is very important. Basically, looking at the law on the one hand, but also at institutions, and for example, at curriculums in schools and higher education. So what history is being taught? Who teaches it in which way? As one example, where we can find inequality and discrimination towards individuals.
Sound.
I'm really sorry. This is the first time this is happening. I don't know why. So I'll just try to continue having the time in mind. So we have this as like a structural critique to the multiple forms of violence that communities and individuals face. Intersectionality theory, on the other hand, basically states that we need to look at these disadvantages without hierarchy. This is very important in the conceptualization, in fact, of intersectionality theory, to my mind at least. Class then becomes classism, meaning the experience of not fitting into a middle or upper class setting and being structurally denied access to the upper echelons of society, or the ceiling, if you want. And class becomes one more oppression among many: sexism, racism, ableism. So I suggest that I stop here just for time reasons, and I will just keep elaborating why for me in the research, but also my practical political engagement, I feel that it is very important to understand.
Sound, Eleanor.
To understand, I'm really sorry, these differences. I'm going to try to fix the sound situation, and I hope to fix this and give the mic over back to the moderation.
Thank you, Eleonora. Thank you. Yeah, sorry for the sound problems that happens to all of us. I hope we can all fix it, and the Zoom will treat you better in the next session. I just got a note from the people who are kindly interpreting what we are talking. They're asking all of us, maybe not when we speak, to try to speak relatively slowly so that they can really catch what we're talking about and interpret it to everybody. And also, if we read off our notes, also to do it slowly so that they can catch up with us. So I would appreciate if we can all do that, because it's for the for the best so that it can be translated to Spanish and French. Now, yeah, thank you, Eleonora. Again, the question was about the insight of intersectional approach in your work concretely, and you, Ruth, you're using this methodology in your research. So could you give us, share with us some insights and accounts of what you do with this intersectional lens?
Of course. Thank you. Thank you for the space. And I like that we're approaching these subjects from experience. I think it's very important to address all these theorizations, make it, put it in embody them, right? Because it's not only discourse, it affects everybody's lives. And it's, so I like that we get to speak from more particular experiences. Mm-hmm. And in this regard, my experience and knowledge on intersectionality are also incarnated as both academic knowledge, but also experience. I started my work as an activist in the feminist movement in Dominican Republic, and soon into first year or so of being militant, hosting a space in the Dominican Republic for feminist or female focused dialogue, I realized that the feminist theory or approach did not address my issues, particularly as a woman of color in Dominican Republic, as a Black woman. And so that brought me very fortunately to Junta de Prietas, which is the collective that I co-created with colleagues, friends, and partners that are also militant in activism. I got to learn from very prominent feminist theorists and researchers from Latin America. And I found that intersectionality is a frame of analysis, that it helps understand the multitude of experiences and perhaps de-universalize, or actually wants to de-universalize the category women, because it understands the construction of the category women as a historical construct that has been branded by colonialism, ethnocentrism, and is very Western. And for us, nations of the Caribbean, Latin America, America in general, the countries that were formerly colonies, we have this added historical experience of being imposed a series of structures that are foreigners from our native cultures, both in the territory of Abya Yala and also African rooted traditions that were brought to these territories forcibly for slave work. And the weight of that historical reality has shaped the way in which we organize our societies. So when we think about intersectionality, we have by force, we have to understand the historical background that brought us here, and how when the category women is created, it regards a specific kind of women and not all women. And that's why that experience has to be revised. And I think that's the use of intersectionality, understanding that that category is not universal, and that gender is not the main, for many women, is not even the first cause of oppression for many women. And that there are multiple ways of life that in which the inequalities between genders is not the core issue that affect women or what we regard as women. In that respect, the research that we are undertaking currently in the newly created Caribbean Institute for Decolonial Thought and Research, is that there still are amongst ourselves, among our cultures, there are other cultures and ways of life in which relationships between genders are not as the Western patterns show. And it's beautiful to understand that there are a historical resistance to this imposition of relationships in which there's an inequality between male and female in this hierarchical position in there. Even Oyeronke Oyewumi, that author, that African author, addresses it through the lens of Yoruba tradition, how gender is not even regarded in their vocabulary. There's not the seniority is the base of social organization and not gender. And so I think this is the use of the intersectional lens or approach, understanding the multiplicity of relationships of power, and that gender is not the only thing or even the main thing that affects men and women or people around the world. And so it's not even, or there's also the other side of it, in which you think that intersectionality is like a campaign that to add oppression upon oppression to see who is more oppressed than who.
Yeah.
And it is not so either. It's just, it helps explain and understanding the different positions that different women have in this wide spectrum, which is oppression, and how these differentiated systems of oppression, as Eleonora was mentioning, racism, sexism, classism, they don't work separately, but they co-create each other, co-sustain each other, and cooperate to make these experiences very particular for women of color, women that are migrants, women that are disabled. And it's just not the same. It's just not the same. And so I like that we're approaching this subject with this audience, so we can address essentialisms as an obstacle for really understanding intersectionality and undertaking measures to mitigate those differences, or at the very, very least, just understanding the wide picture, the wider picture of it. I don't want to take any more time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you. Yes, now I would like to give the mic to Vashti. Vashti, are you're muted still? Yeah, great.
Thank you so much. I think, I also love how we're coming from our personal stories, and I would love to also start with that. And I think my experience with feminism or feminisms in my country was, I think there is that sense of belongingness, but because of certain identities that you hold that does not align to the main grand narrative of womanhood or feminism, at the same time, there is a sense of alienation, right? And so you're in this between navigating the mainstream feminism that is out there, and also the queer praxis, or the combination of your theorizing and your practice of queerness, and how does that integrate to the feminisms that you practice in the Philippines, for example. During the side event, during the Generation Equality Forum, one of my colleagues in that session from the PACT, Faith Uno, she's a young activist, and she said that you cannot, and I quote, "You cannot use an old map to explore a new world, and what worked 20 years ago may not necessarily work now." And I think that was a very powerful statement, especially in how we're using intersectionality, because I think one of the criticisms to intersectionality, especially when having discussions with other folks, is that it somewhat dilutes, right, a certain movement or a certain struggle or oppression that the feminist movements or women's movement or whatever movement is trying to address. And so it makes the work more difficult, as they say. But that's not how our human experience works, right? Because we are so diverse and we have different lived realities coming from different positions. And so going back to my notes, so for me, and based from the practice, an observation from the collective work that I did with young people in all their diversity, especially from our marginalized positions in the Global South, is that this intersectionality for us is an overarching insight in the multidimensionality of our lived experiences and identifications, in which this multiple axes of oppression and privileges intersect and are compounded. And that systems of oppressions or privileges take different forms depending on the context and takes different ways of doing intersectionality practice. So as mentioned earlier from my bio, I am engaged with forging intersectional feminist futures in Asia Pacific, in South Asia and Southeast Asia. And what I realized from my observation was that since this is a network of regional, the consortium constitutes of regional networks, we are coming from different ways of doing intersectional praxis, and this unique experience we want to complement along the way. So the project is very new and based from our initial progress, one very seemingly highlighted is the need for accessibility and investment to accessibility. And when we talk about accessibility, this is not only the availability of interpretation, for example, but also the acceptability of language, right? Because as a criticism, even for me, I'm struggling with how I translate language that captures what I'm trying to say in my local dialect or local language, even in my national language. So, and that is one of the criticisms that we highlighted as a consortium, that when we work in the Philippines, in Cambodia, in India, in Indonesia, there is an expertise of intersectional praxis, and yet these are not highlighted or not even translated that is acceptable, appropriate, responsive for us in the consortium, but even also for from their networks. Part of this discussion is also, aside from accessibility, there's also the need to discuss security in a more intersectional praxis, meaning because we're coming from, because the consortium is coming from marginalized groups of networks, and and our constituents are coming from, these are folks who are marginalized by the systems of oppressions that are in place. Security has been an issue, and of course, security in the digital space, as sex workers, being a woman or being gender diverse is different. And that also differs from the geographical location and the culture that exists. And so these new ways of understanding or doing or practicing or praxis of intersectionality becomes, as much as it is nuanced, it is also very important that that it's important to as a consortium, how we collectively move forward and recognize and make anti-oppressive approaches to combat accessibility and security issues that we are facing. So.
Okay. Thank you very much, Vashti. Yeah, it's very good to be aware not only of the very strong layers like security, or as Ruth mentioned, the historical sides, but about also the subtle ones that I think takes much more work and sensibility to see and to deal with. And now I would really like to give our ears and to Farah to tell us about your insights in your work using their intersectional approach, Farah.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'll try my best to speak slowly, but let me know if that doesn't work. Okay. Firstly, since I'm speaking about the struggles of migrant communities here, allow me a little bit on the context in Lebanon and the downhill full-on crash in the last 2 years, so that you have an idea what I'm talking about. Okay. So less than 2 years ago, October 2019, people were, me included, were fed up with the ruling class, and a beautiful uprising builds up against corruption. People fill the streets, such a strong and intense connection of everyone. Of course, soon after, violence erupts and implodes by state factions and militia thugs to get people off the streets and to put everyone back home. Saying this to say that even at our highest high and our best times in Lebanon in the last 2 years, which was end of 2019, in the middle of this situation of back and forth, even the revolutionary vibe was not actively welcoming and inclusive of migrant workers and refugees. They were told to go back home. They would be scapegoated right and left, online, offline, media, otherwise as well. It was clear to them that this was not a safe revolution for them to call theirs as well, as people who live and work here. Soon after this, we had a full-on financial crisis, banks confiscating people's lifetime savings. The Lebanese currency, the Lebanese lira, loses 90% of its value, and it's still crashing as we speak. Skyrocketing of food and supermarket prices. Then comes February 2020. I'm trying to speak things chronologically here. So February 2020, the pandemic is worldwide news now, and it has reached Lebanon as well. Curfews and lockdowns and state control of who goes in and out. Corona numbers are spiking and everybody's very scared. Everybody's losing their job because of the crisis, including migrant workers who have been thrown out of their employers' houses and filling the streets of Beirut in front of their embassies, consulates, horrible patterns, basically, absolutely horrible, very visual, very clear to the eye patterns in the last year of families discarding of their domestic workers like there were washing machines that have gone stopped working. Then comes August 2020, and the biggest non-nuclear explosion in the history of the world hits Lebanon, hits the capital, Beirut. The magnitude of damage is unreal. There's no official story. I mean, I'm talking to you now, November 2021, a year plus later. There is no official story of what happened on that day. No accountability whatsoever to this horrendous crime. And just a few days later, on August 8th, when people went down to the streets again before everyone was buried, before the count was done, people went down and were protesting the absurdity of what we're living here. And what we were faced with was more shooting by the police, of course, because that is their only language. So homelessness levels increase, abandonment of migrant domestic workers. More of this happens, housing crisis, schooling crisis, medicine crisis. I mean, in Lebanon, cancer patients were literally protesting on the streets last year and this year because they can't access their treatment. That level of bad. So I'm just trying to give you a context of how bad it is to the average person, to the average citizen in Lebanon today, in order for me to move to the next step and talk about what would it be like for a migrant worker then. So I said all types of crisis. Then there's the vaccine drive and all the challenges that come with that. Electricity crisis. I mean, in Lebanon today, I mean, I don't know if you would even understand what I'm saying, but we get electricity for 1 to 2 hours a day, if we can afford it, right? And then you get generator option if you have the money for it. So basically, I mean, yeah, people are in the dark all the time. People have to go up and down 10 floors every day because there's no elevator. It's just crazy. And then there's a few public transportation catastrophe. Most people are pushed into extreme poverty, general absurd overall living conditions for everyone. And of course, the government is absent except for checkpoints, intimidation tactics here and there, and definitely always more so against non-Lebanese people. So there's a general state of existential fear, was and still is, of feeling unsafe. And I mean, it's one thing as well for me to feel unsafe, and it's another thing for me to feel unsafe and I have a family to take care of. And it's one thing for me to be a migrant worker with a family to take care. I'm not even in my country and I have all these things happening and I don't know what to do. I can't go back, I can't stay, I can't. Yeah. So these, what I quickly mentioned now, these are all the common levels of minimal daily suffering endured by an average person living here, right? How do we imagine the same conditions to apply if this person was a migrant worker? This is what I would like to focus on.
Okay.
Or a migrant domestic worker. So for me to do, I would like to pause a little bit and look at Lebanon pre-2020, before all of this hell ride we're on, and give you a brief on what things looked like for a migrant worker before the crisis, right? So,
but Farah, just a brief, please. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to say that the environment was already very hostile, very aggressive, racist, unsafe, etc. It was very normalized. I mean, it's been documented and normalized to have reported violations around all types of vulnerabilities for migrant domestic workers, exploitation, sexual violence, abuse, economic, underpayment, no payment at all. Okay, I'm going to skip a little bit here, but I mean, standard procedure was that the situation was already hell for migrant workers, right? Before this whole crisis. So basically what I'm trying to say here is that migrant domestic workers not only have to face today all the conditions of being in Lebanon in 2020, 2021, but they're also facing what they used to face before. It's still moving with them. They're still living under the kafala system, the sponsorship system, the horrendous system of immigration that is in Lebanon and the region. They're still excluded from the Lebanese labor law. They're not even seen as workers, not even on paper. So they're on paper, they don't exist. In addition to the de facto racist environment that is hosting them and that they're suffering from every day. Last thing I say before we go to the second question. I just want to give an example. The simplest activity for a migrant worker, I mean, assuming she has a day off, assuming she has, 1 day off a month or something, the simplest activity of going to the beach for a migrant worker is a struggle, right? But it is, of course, not the same for a Filipino migrant worker than it is for an Ethiopian worker. I mean, it's a whole different experience. It's a different dynamic, different experience of oppression altogether, but it's still one. There's a different set of analysis and goggles that we need to use when we're looking at the situation of two migrant workers. And I'll go into examples of how we do that, or how we do that in the work that I'm doing with the anti-racism movement when we get to the second question. Sorry, this took a lot of time.
That's no problem at all, dear Farah. I think it was a great reality check for all of us. Thank you very much for this really first insight into the reality of your country at the moment through you and through the people you work with. And I think it was also a great illustration of what Ruth mentioned before, that often that gender inequality is not only and often not the core inequality or a point of discrimination that can be attached to a person, and that definitely that very complex reality that you now gave us insight into illustrates those really immense complexity and layers that you have to deal with, and that is in life around you. So thank you for that. No problem with time at all. And just we were you Farah, now you're working a lot with migrant workers, which again brings us to that despite our intersectional approach, where we try not to go into binary thinking, not about really thinking in boxes or in strict categories, we still have to use like some kind of categories or labels or names. So that's where my next question is going. And the question goes, how can we demand, for example, justice for specific groups of people facing multiple forms of discrimination without stigmatizing and stereotyping? So how can we avoid stigmatizing and stereotyping in this intersectional approach? So what is the experience in your work, in your research, so the experience that you can share with us? And I would like now here to invite Vashti, if you would like to share with us your answer to this.
Hello, yeah, sure. So I think the question is it's a very complicated question, right? Because there's a lot of things to consider. And so I would talk, I guess, on the methodologies in terms of how we do intersectionality praxis, right? That helped us bridge how we define justice and how we claim it. So because I am also a member of the Youth Coalition, before the Generation Equality Forum, we had these consultations with marginalized groups of young people. And one of the methodologies that we did was there is a specific focus group discussions with two spirited LGBTQIA plus young people, and then other young sex workers, and so on and so forth. And I was part of the methodology was really to ensure that young people who identify to those identities co-create, co-lead, and co-generate data from the young people that they are with. And there's a lot of interesting, maybe not really findings, because it's an evolving discussion, of interesting concepts that highlighted that, aside from, because I think there's a discussion that it is not just, sometimes it is not our gender that is the main concern that we have, right? That needs a specific response at that moment. But interestingly, during our conversations, and this is it's a thematic, it's like a transversal observation or experience of everyone coming from different parts of the world. And most of our participants and partners are from the global south, is that how colonialism has affected us very different, maybe differently, but there's that sameness, right? And so, and also how sometimes there is a certain oppression, and there's like a way to respond to it, but the response is very oppressive as well of other identities. Maybe the response was ableist, right? Was transphobic, swarthy, right? And so those conversations were highlighted. So for the Youth Coalition, we were able to generate an intersectionality. This is still on the way. It is still an evolving discussion, but we started an intersectionality guide, and we highlighted two approaches. They are actually the same, the decolonial and the anti-oppressive approach. So, and this is made from the lens of young folks in their margin and in all their diversity from the global south. And when we talk about, say, for example, decolonial and anti-oppressive approach, we are also looking at pleasure and care, and how does it go with the work that we do, right? So one concrete example from our focus groups is how it creates a sense of belongingness. So a lot of trans and queer and gender diverse folks feel safe to discuss certain specific issues and concerns that are not really talked about, how there is joy for for some trans men and non-binary folks to talk about their menstruation. And then there's euphoria in talking about it in non-stigmatizing conversation, and acknowledging our experience, our various experience of menstruation, for example. And so I think that's one way of looking at justice, maybe not very concretely, but like a different way of navigating, ensuring that we are not stereotyping, we are anti-oppressive, and also looking at it as in a very decolonial lens. So as for the other engagements like the Young Feminist Manifesto that was published just this year by young feminists, we have this methodology of co-leadership, co-ownership, and accountability. So in all levels, so of course, young people from different parts of the world in different contexts, in all their diversity, would look at it very differently. But for the for the Youth Coalition, we see this as that from the deciding stage until the end of an advocacy or program or activity, young people are engaged, have a sense of ownership on that space, that they feel that they are also creating and they are leading together with other young people or maybe older folks, right? And for the Forging Intersectional Feminist Futures that we are having as a consortium, it is more of a grounded theorizing methodological work of navigating justice. And I think from this grounded work, so of course, when you do grounded theory or praxis, it can take time, but that's how we want to be accessible and also inclusive of everyone, right? So since I've mentioned earlier that we already have, coming from our regional networks, we have different ways of doing intersectionality praxis coming from different points. There's also a need for us to strengthen and hone this intersectional praxis in Asia Pacific, in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, and hopefully our project answers that, or if not, at least explore that, learning from each other, co-learning, right, and co-designing with our national partners. So I would stop that, and hopefully that will contribute later on to more comprehensive discussion on justice.
Thank you, Vashti. Thanks a lot for you. In your response, you mentioned the anti-oppressive and anti-colonial approaches, and you also stressed the concept of co-ownership. And if what I read about the work of the speakers, these are, if I'm not wrong, also very important concepts for you, Ruth, aren't they, in your methodology in demanding justice? So could you tell us more about it, please?
Of course. Thank you so much. I think it wasn't my turn originally, but you're handling it beautifully, Jelena, or Jelena, sorry. And I subscribe a lot to what Vashti just commented in the approach that we're addressing in the Institute, in the Caribbean Institute for Decolonial Thought and Research. Recognition is base. It's fundamental. So we work to recuperate or to rescue, let's say, memories of resistance in rural communities in Dominican Republic, specifically right now in Santo Domingo, which is the capital and all. But these are semi-rural, marginalized communities. And this is what I was addressing with my previous point, like how we disregard other worlds and other ways to relate each other in society when we center ourselves. And I think a good way or a good approach or the start of a good approach to avoid being stereotyping or just putting labels is checking our own privilege. And that's something that the anti-racist and decolonial approach do continuously. And that, I think, differentiates these movements from other movements for liberation. Because pretty much in other movements of liberation, the rules are already set. But anti-racism and decoloniality, as they are growing, they keep checking on themselves, their ways, their methodologies, their theorization, and all of that. So first, you have to locate yourself, basically, like acknowledge that in this network of oppression, in this in where all of these oppressions intersect, you have a space in which you are oppressed on one side but privileged in another side. So for example, in our group of research and our group of activism, we consider that we're already we're not privileged, but we are more privileged than other women, just by the fact that we get to study this subject and reflect on these subjects. Because most women, the most oppressed women in the Caribbean, Dominican Republic, they can't sit down and read Simone de Beauvoir or go to a conference or none of that. They're too busy living life day by day, and that doesn't put them in a position in which us as anti-racist or decolonial feminists or feminists in general can come and marginalize these people. So I think we have to be very careful in the way that we approach marginalized communities by not trying to be condescending with them. We have to know when to give space. And this is the approach that we're doing at the Institute right now. Instead of us, because the relationship between a researcher and subject of research that or person or groups that we're trying to study or work with, it's a very hierarchical relationship as well. So from our institute, what we're trying to do is to establish a more horizontal relationship in which we let the community speak for themselves and say, what are their interests? What is it that is problematic to them from their perspective and not from our perspective? Because we come with our own academic baggage and privilege, and we are not living their realities. The ones that should voice their concerns is them, and we cannot be gatekeeping or talking for, because we are stripping those people from their power. And they are actually like thinking like that, thinking, oh, let's go help this marginalized community. Let's go try and save them is very condescending and disempowering, when in fact they have been resistant without us all of this time, without the intervention of the feminist movement or specialized researchers or government. These are people that are struggling with the social conditions that are very tough to face on a daily basis, low income, less access to basic rights, education, health, and all of that. But still, their ways of life are not lesser than other ways of life. And this is what we're trying to showcase, how in these communities, the contrast of how they live their lives outside of the worldly impositions that we live when we're like in the main cities or all that, and specifically us as academics or researchers or as people that are working in the system. These people are operating and living day-to-day life outside of the system. They have different ways to approach even the way that they grow their food, the way that they many of these women that we've been talking to, they haven't bought groceries in a market and in their entire lives. I'm talking about 80-year-old, 100-year-old women, because they have a different relationship even with earth that we lack. So instead of approaching them from a maternalizing or condescending position, which we sometimes will have just to sit down and listen and be taught by these people instead of us trying to save them. And yes, I think this is to not go overboard. This approach is in fact decolonial and anti-racist, because it defocuses our experience and actually in the construction of knowledge. It's not us trying to build this knowledge. It's us letting the communities speak for themselves and to construct the research along with us. So Vashti, as you were saying, co-creation, cooperation. The relationship grows together and is not being imposed like vertically, but is co-created horizontally. And it's not for us to write a little paper and come and show it in a nice conference and left nothing in the community, because that's an extractivist dynamic that's very colonial. So we're trying to avoid those kinds of dynamics. And if we're working with that community, we want to the community to get something from this research. And it's not only presenting this research. In this case, we are collecting these memories of resistance of the eldest women from the community and putting them in a little comic book, so the kids in school can access it after these women are gone, and that knowledge can remain in the community. So basically, that's the work that we're developing at the institute right now, and hopefully is enlightening for somebody here.
I'm sure it is. Thank you, Ruth. And again, I would like just to take on this concept of co-ownership or co-creating in working together. And I wonder, Farah, how do you see that in your methodology of your work?
Hi. Yes, absolutely.
And how does it look like, concretely?
Yeah, I think this applies perfectly to the case of organizing with migrant workers in Lebanon, which is what we do at the anti-racism movement and the migrant community centers. It's very important for us in the way of work, the way we do our work, to acknowledge that migrant workers and migrant communities are not one. I mean, I've been in meetings where you've been trying to force this, other local organizations that have just started working with migrant workers to, have migrant workers in the room, like the ABC things. And then after, meetings and conversations and just so much time put where it shouldn't be put, it should be put elsewhere. You get statements like, so is it enough to have one migrant worker in the room? Like, like there are 20 Lebanese people sitting on the table, and this woman is asking you if one migrant worker is enough to represent the 500,000 migrant domestic workers in the country. And she's serious about her question, because she has absolutely no feminist perspective, no intersectional a framework whatsoever. So this question is an innocent question that makes perfect sense to her. So I'm saying this to say that, yeah, this applies perfectly to organizing with migrant workers in Lebanon, because they are not one bulk, and they are not one, they're not a homogeneous group. To each is their own specificity and struggle and exploitations faced. So it's absolutely important and essential that we acknowledge this and see this in order to act upon it and design our work strategies, tactics accordingly. So it's important to understand that a migrant worker is different than a migrant worker who's a mother. A migrant worker who's a migrant worker who's a mother is different than a single mom who's a migrant worker in Lebanon, or a mom of a child who is unregistered because they cannot be registered because the father is out of the picture. Or because the father is violent and is intimidating the mom to not register the child, or a migrant worker who has a child who has a disability, or who is autistic, or who has any kind of difficulty. I mean, how would she navigate all the impossibilities of being in Lebanon and getting her child somewhere where she could get him quality education? A Black migrant worker is different than a brown migrant worker in Lebanon. Of course, experience is totally different. There is a commonality, but it is still different. And we need to acknowledge this as we design anything going forward if we want to do serious work in organizing with these communities. One that speaks English versus one that doesn't, one that can navigate the language barriers in Lebanon versus one that's just arrived here. For example, we can't expect a vaccine, since we're in the middle of the pandemic still. We can't expect a vaccine rollout strategy that doesn't take into consideration that half the migrant workers in Lebanon are documented, have access to their papers, and half of them don't. I mean, most of the vaccine drives up to the moment expect the migrant worker to submit her papers, any form of papers when she goes to the hospital. But how is she supposed to do that? Now, we know very well that under the sponsorship system, papers, passports, work permits, whatnot of migrant workers are easily confiscated, and nobody asks the employer anything. So they can take her papers and then she's stuck here forever unless she's able to do alternative papers. So if we don't take take all these details in consideration as we are going forward, there is no going forward really. Another example, for example, if we think of a migrant domestic worker who's in an abusive partner violence situation. I mean, if I'm a Lebanese person living here and I'm in an abusive relationship, that's one thing. Okay, even if I'm in a low-income situation, I leave the house of my abuser. I go to my friends, to my family, somewhere. I have some form of safe haven somewhere. If I'm a migrant worker and all I know is my husband or my boyfriend or whatnot, and I need to leave this abusive, violent households, I don't have many options, do I? So it's very important that we also cater to these diversions. In relation to the blast, for example, migrant workers who survived the blast, who made it out alive from this blast, because many of the victims were migrant workers and are still nameless to the moment. So migrant workers described the living through this blast as a double trauma, which it is. First, there's the shock of the actual explosion, and then there's the indifference of the whole, the society you're living in. As to whether you live or die, as to whether we put your name or we don't, or if we count you in the official. For the longest time, the official count of the people who were killed in the explosion didn't include the names of Ethiopian women, Syrian refugees, etc. People had to fight for these names to be part of this list. We are still at that level. So the effects of the explosion of August 4, 2020 in Lebanon cannot be separated, as I've been trying to say here, from the everyday realities of racism and kafala in Lebanon for a migrant worker. What does it mean to endure this blast while you are not even in your own country, and while you can't leave because you don't have access to your papers, or because, I don't know, your husband is in prison, in detention? There's a million reasons why migrant workers can't leave. It's not always because, there's the very simplistic question that most Lebanese people ask: if they don't like it here, why don't they leave? Because they can't leave for a million obvious reasons, right? Or they don't want to leave. I mean, what does a migrant worker who's from a certain country or a certain continent and married to another migrant worker from another continent and have a child together, how does she leave? Where does she leave? Does she leave to Sudan, or does she leave to Sri Lanka? If the children are not registered or they don't have the passports of the parents, leaving the country, no matter how bad the situation is today, means separation for life. So these are things that we need to take into consideration. The list is very long, so I'm not going to go into further examples to make a space for others. But yeah, it's good to really think of the specificities of the different identities and what they mean for everyday life for people.
Thank you, Farah, and also a great ending. I would like again to take that ending, this specific specificity of different and really identities that we all have is something that definitely can lead us in our struggle to avoid stigmatizing and stereotyping. And here I would like also to ask Eleonora, how do you deal with this in your research, or how do you really see this question of demanding justice for groups of people, but really trying to avoid stereotyping and stigmatizing? What is your methodology? What leads you on this way?
So I will try to mic and what is happening.
Unfortunately,
I think now it works.
Try again.
Okay, can you hear?
Half. We can just hear some words.
Okay, I'm just gonna comes back. I don't know. Okay, maybe we try it this way. No,
it's not working. It was, I think, better before. No.
Yeah. It's just jumping back and forth. It's just like, why? Shall I just try and just try to keep checking the mic? as much as I can.
Yeah, maybe let's give it a try and then we'll see how it's working. Yeah.
If it doesn't work, I can reconnect with my, you can continue the next round, and I'll just make that because it's just.
Yes,
Just repeat
Eleanor,
with my
it's on
phone.
and off. I think you might have to check with your if you can use your phone instead.
I will reconnect and continue with the next.
yes, yeah. Thank you, Natalia, for coming in, and thank you, Eleonora. I think it's just not working out this way, so please just try to find another way. We're keeping our fingers crossed, and then we'll speak to you a bit later. And I would like then to lead us to the third round of questions, or it's basically it's a kind of rounding also question. We have now talked and reflected on this intersectional approach. We mentioned layers that go between racism, neocolonialism. We mentioned classism, different layers of economic inequalities, gender discriminations, and many other discriminations. What I have noted is something that struck me as very important is that is being mentioned as the different isms can be even obstacles, can be obstacles to intersectional approach. So maybe I would like also to keep that, or would be interested to hear how do you see that? In which way do different isms can be obstacles in this approach? And also, I would like to ask you to share with us what steps of really for action would need, in your way, in this kind of approach, in this intersectional approach, would need to be more prominent in our collective thinking, coming so from your work, from your experience. So if you would like to comment on this, why are the isms obstacles in our intersectional approach, please do that. If not, you can just leave it out and just tell us what steps for action you find the most important really for us to take out of this webinar, and what are really very important for all of us to spread the word in our collective thinking, in our collective action. Would be grateful if you can share that with us. And Farah, could I ask you to share it with us first, please?
We all come with different kinds of experiences, and these are not small details to dismiss. I cannot invite domestic workers to a women's march preparation meeting and not make the effort to have the meeting at a time that works for them in their very late schedules. And then say, yeah, I always invite them, but they don't show up. I mean, intersectionality is intended to push us to do the right effort in addressing one form of oppression and the obstacles that come with it, when we actively take others into account. And this requires us getting out of our bubbles and out of our comfort zones and going that one extra mile to be able to work, serve, and organize constructively with the populations that we have given example of in this webinar. I'm going to give just a few examples of things that I think are tangible and that we could be slightly more aware of as we continue doing our work. This is something we try to keep in mind all the time at the anti-racism movement. So one, migrant domestic workers, in the case of my example, or any other vulnerable population, they do not owe us any of their time. So whether I'm a media person, an activist, a researcher, and I need to meet with a migrant worker for any reason, I need to pay her her labor, which is her time, which is her skipping another job to come to my meeting, her transportation fees, etc. I need to respect when people don't have time or energy or motivation to engage with me on whatever level I want them to engage with me on. Especially, I mean, in the case when I'm talking about people who have just exited a very traumatic situation of captivity, of a bad labor agreement or whatnot. So I shouldn't insist on interviews, let alone last-minute interviews. And I should find a way to get the information I need from elsewhere or from someone else who's less stressed. So don't pressure, don't insist. If we're engaging with a group of women for a focus group, for example, we have to make sure to account for those that have children with them. Hire them entertainment, a babysitter, a clown, make good food available, spectrum. But do not expect mothers to just discard of their children because I need to meet with them for 2 hours, and then they have this extra labor of having to worry about this in addition to everything else they have to worry about in their day as well. Also, support creating spaces for alternative or underground migrant-led organizing in the absence of unions, in the case of Lebanon and the region I'm coming from. So invite migrant activists to meetings, to participate in demonstrations, to write in your journals, whatever space you have, share it, and share it well. Don't share it performatively. Share it really well, openly, meaningly. Account for those who are literate, for those who are not, for those who are tech savvy and know how to use all the new apps today or not or don't, for those who are comfortable speaking which languages, etc. On the same point, always provide translation, interpretation in meetings, or don't invite people in the first place. I mean, if you're inviting migrant communities and you're not going to invite to provide the basic ABCs of communication, this is a waste of their time before your time. Last 2 points. Less classical awareness raising and empowerment, and more efforts, genuine efforts pushing towards people having access to resources that guide them in their own organizing and choices. They decide what to prioritize. They decide what initiatives to start. Support migrant-led initiatives all the time, whenever you have the chance. Lastly, when providing services, if that's what you do not put restricting conditions on migrant domestic workers. So the best example in the case of Lebanon here is documentation. I mentioned it a little bit when I spoke about the vaccine. So knowing that the majority of employers confiscate the worker's passport, putting official documentation for anything like the vaccine or something else is a barrier. It reinforces the trauma and a sense of loss, of being deprived of one of your most important essential rights as a human being, which is, identification. Mm-hmm. Most importantly, last point, I promise, to constantly, it's a suggestion to constantly keep ourselves in check and ask ourselves, how are we pushing to advance for emancipation and freedoms, not just generic rights and protection. Because the struggle and the dreams of migrant domestic workers, asylum seekers, refugees, all the different severely marginalized groups here extends beyond the ABCs of rights as we seem to think they are here sometimes. And thank you.
Thank you, Farah, for sharing this with us. And now I would like to give the mic to Vashti to tell us her experience.
So for me, I think as informed by our collective thinking with young folks with disability and US LGBTQIA and other partners that we have, I think I've mentioned earlier the discussions on security and accessibility. Those are, I think, very concrete steps that every one of us here can take away from if we want to. So when we talk about, right, so in terms of even the conversations of acceptability of the information that we're saying and responsiveness of those knowledge that we try to, sometimes in the global advocacy that we're doing, how the trickle down effect of development work has been, and the neoliberal thinking of intersectionality work sometimes, and most of the time, tokenizes marginalized groups of folks. And so it's important to be very conscious about it and important to not do any harm. But in a more theoretical, I guess, perspective and enrichment of our intersectionality praxis is the inclusion of environmental justice, disability justice, and even queer and trans feminist praxis in the work that we do. So, for example, this is informed by CREA and the Global South Women Forum that ERA-AP has facilitated, where there's a feminist vision of environmental justice that is also intersectional. So you can also check that in our YouTube. I don't want to copy what they've mentioned, and I think there's beauty and richness especially from young folks. I think that's my bias, where young folks were really very eager to share and was very passionate on claiming our rights and the justice that we deserve, especially coming from Global South, which we are mostly affected by the climate crisis, right? And how the climate crisis also disables us, right? So in a very neoliberal, neo-colonial approach of development, we see that there's a 10 to 15% folks who are disabled, and 80% of those are from the Global South. And these are not just because, and these are not just genetic, or because by the way, when I talk about disability, I'm talking about the diversity of human experience, and that's part. And I think how and that's part of the conversation in disability justice, but also how other forms of oppression, especially neocolonialism and neoliberalism and capitalism, has debilitated a lot of folks from the Global South, especially marginalized groups, such as women who are working in, say, for example, in the clothing industry, right? Or in agriculture, and queer and gender diverse folks who had to undergo conversion therapy, or had to undergo gender corrections, right? Genital surgeries to correct their genitals, which the gender binary is a very colonial concept, at least in Asia. And so framing or enriching the conversations on the neo-colonial models of disability and environmental justice, I think for me as a practitioner, as much as I want to claim it, of intersectionality praxis, enriches the conversation. And this is what I'm saying, that we have different ways of doing intersectionality work, right? And also the recognition that marginalized or being in a marginalized groups has also created our own hierarchies based from the oppressions and privileges that we have, right? So, for example, and this is something that we are very critical and conscious about. So, for example, for young people who are young indigenous people who are in a patriarchal society, and they identify as queer, and queerness is not something that is recognized in their community. And then their leaders would say that, in terms of cultural acceptability or appropriateness, the gender diversity is not something that we acknowledge, right? And I think favoring or reinforcing or amplifying the voices of those who experience the multiple burdens of oppression, and ensuring that they have the space to claim their rights and that they have ownership on that claim. I think that is something that we as researchers and activists and advocates have to be very conscious about, and hopefully can be a takeaway from this conversation. And part of also the queer and trans feminist practice that I've been mentioning is this criticism on the compulsory cis heterosexuality and able-bodiedness. And so that is a conversation even in queer and trans feminist work, right? Because there's a lot of conversations on, okay, so if you do medical transitioning, you are actually maiming yourself, right? And that's something that a very ableist conversation or narrative. And being conscious of those on how we advocate, for example, trans healthcare, right? And even how cis folks occupy spaces for for trans health, for example, because recently, just this year, let me check the title. There's this No Data, No More that was published by trans and gender diverse experts. And this No Data, No More is a manifesto calling out how medical healthcare has been using a very cis heteronormative and abled approach in generating, actually exploiting data from trans, non-binary, gender diverse in all their diversity, right? And so, and going back to what the Young Feminist Manifesto says, it's important how the conception or the consciousness of co-ownership, co-leadership, and accountability with others and with ourselves and with the marginalized groups that we amplify has been thoroughly discussed or at least positioned. So yeah.
Thanks. Thank you, Vashti, and thank you for reminding us how important it is that we really go on enriching this framework of intersectional tools that we have at the moment, because of course, in order to keep them alive and to keep them accurate, we really have to always bring in new things. The more we see, the more then it will be there that we can act upon. So thank you for bringing that up again. And I think that definitely also includes, and that's what I took from Farah, what she said, that one of the very important things is really to take others actively into account. I think that's the only way we can also do it the way that you mentioned, Vashti. And now I would like to invite Ruth to share with us maybe her view of which aspects of intersectionality or which steps for action you, Ruth, from your own work and experience, you find the most important to bring up here to remind us that it should be more prominent in our collective thinking and acting.
Of course. Yeah, talking about practical things or steps that we can take is very important. But I think if we don't do the theoretical work behind it, we're just, as we would say in Spanish, we're just kicking to the air, kicking in the air with not an aim. Just sometimes it becomes even a little bit performative, the actions that we take. Oh, inclusion. Oh, but those is like those are like band-aid solutions to the problem. So if we don't address the theorization, the ideas, the focus before we shift actioning, those actions are not going to they're not going to be rendered effective or as effective as they should be on the long run. Mm-hmm. And so to my understanding, if we are talking about intersectionality as a movement and from the feminist perspective, the focus has to shift. The focus has to shift from an unilateral one oppression target to a multi-oppression target. Because as we have already, and previously stated, all the participants in this talk, gender equality doesn't fix the problem of all women. It doesn't even address all women. And so, because it's based on a conception of women that's very exclusive, that Sojourner Truth said it in the 1800s. Am I not a woman? Am I not a woman because you're not regarding me in everything that you're stating here? You are striving for work. My mom, my grandma, we have been in the labor market as commodities, and now as we've been here, like we don't need access to work. We don't need access because we've been doing this. So you're not talking about us. You're not regarding us. So if we don't shift the framework and the frame of analysis, we're not gonna take effective actioning at the end. It's just gonna be a momentary, and I say that these actions are not useful in some contexts, but it's not gonna serve the purpose of collectively and permanently enlarging this movement. Mm-hmm. So first, I would say that we have to address the focus of the feminist struggle. If this is a movement for liberation, it only liberates a certain amount of women in a certain amount of context. It's not a movement of liberation at all. It has to liberate everybody for it to be, that addresses, an array of subjects that maybe we don't have enough time to talk about right now. But confronting all different types of oppression should be at the core of our struggle, at the core of everything. Mm-hmm. Because fixing just one ism doesn't help everybody. It's just going to help a limited amount of people. Mm-hmm. And I think that entails, after that, which I think is crucial for what we're trying to foster here. We have to engage. It's not mandatory that we know about all of these struggles, because it's not our experience. It's not a witch hunt either. But we do have to engage when we see other groups struggling. Like right now in Dominican Republic, there's a horrid situation with pregnant Haitian immigrants in Dominican Republic that are being deported from hospitals. Like immigration would wait for them as they get out with their newborn babies or sick or struggling, or their checkups, and deporting them to Haiti in a manner that not only violates human rights and all that, but also the same the laws, Dominican migratory laws, are being violated by the own government. And so this is to tell that racism in Dominican Republic transgresses all social norms, like so embedded in our social fabric that the government itself, the state, will work against itself in order to do all of this ethnical cleansing that's historical in the context of Dominican Republic. So gender equality does not help immigrant Haitian women. Mm-hmm. Not solely that. We have to think in a broader perspective, engage with them when we see them. Like, maybe we don't understand these struggles, but if we stay silent from our seats of privilege, we're just cooperating with the oppression system. Our silence won't save us and won't save other women either. So, I mean, identity struggles and individual struggles or fights don't address structural larger problems. So maybe we have to shift our thinking and point it at it structurally. How can we change this structure that allows all of these systems of oppression, or this sole system of oppression with all of these tentacles, to operate so freely, and how it makes us accomplices of that in many levels. So I would say, I think that would be my my approach. If we change our focus from the theories, from the theorization, from the at that level, then our actioning is going to follow through. Is gonna follow suit behind it. I don't know if I had anything else to. Yeah, decentralizing women as a category, and just thinking broader, and I think that would shift the actioning after.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ruth. Very also powerful, and for when I think about many of my colleagues, I think also very provocative, where it's like gender inequality does not fix the problem of many women and doesn't even reach up to many women. I think that's very good to hear that. It really rings the bell. I think it shifts something, at least like when I listen to it. It's a good call for thinking broader. And I would like to come to that, what you repeated a few times, that basically even before we engage with our realities, because we engage with the struggles of the oppressed, we engage with what is around us. You said that that it's much it's needed that we fix the theoretical framework first on the lines that you mentioned. And I'm sure that this theoretical framework, Eleonora, that might be something that you know well about. So how do you see that? Do you agree with Ruth that we really need to fix that theoretical framework? And how do you see that? Let's take it on and back to you. We hope that the sound works now.
I hope so too. Can you hear me now well?
Perfectly.
Okay, so something's wrong with my computer, but we will figure that out later. Yeah, I can really connect to what Ruth just said before, because I think that, and just going like one step before, but I'm looking at the time so that we still have time to discuss. I'm still going to shorten a little bit what I wanted to say. One of the things that Ruth mentioned that is very, very provocative and important is to understand the ways that intersectionality as a concept is very easy nowadays integrated and co-opted by neoliberal agendas telling us that, you know, we just need more gay bosses and black cops and women soldiers to do the torture instead of male soldiers, I guess. So there's all of this discussions. From me in Germany, for example, I was quite astonished to see advertisement for the German army, okay, the Bundeswehr, with black faces, with brown women, you know, holding guns and being happy. So I was really reminded on this pinkwashing of the IDF, and, you know, something Germany is learning in a very, in a way that not everyone is understanding that this is something which is not progressive, but regressive. So I think that for me to have, you know, someone like Alice Weidel, again, from the German context, but also internationally known, she is a far right-wing politician, leader of the far-right Alternative für Deutschland party. She's a lesbian, mother of two, together with her partner of Sri Lankan origin. Yet she's one of the people who is representing one of the most anti-women, homophobic, racist policies in the European Union. So I think that to understand on the one hand that our bodies and progressive politics are very easily co-opted for very repressive projects like war, right? Or police forces, etc. And on the other hand, we are trying to navigate this. Oh, look at Margaret Thatcher, look at Barack Obama, look at all of these people who did all these great things because they're big leaders. I mean, Margaret Thatcher is in this book, Goodnight Stories for Little Rebel Girls or something like that, next to communist leaders, basically, you know, next to Frida Kahlo, next to a lot of inspiring people like Angela Davis. So just because of the gender of these people and just because they did something public doesn't mean that they will be doing something in favor of women, of feminism, etc. So I really, really want to underline that we have to take care to not re-essentialize that someone in an identity, in an oppressed identity, necessarily will not have the most progressive analysis or standpoint on these questions, meaning that I believe for political action and political organizing on the one hand, and I mean, my research is in political theory, but is very much informed by my experience as someone, on the one hand, activating in political spaces in the last decade or so, but also as an educational trainer. So I'm someone who teaches German history at the German National Museum. It's called the German Historical Museum. And for me, the histories that are omitted, the histories of resistance, even within Germany, say partisans, anti-fascist partisans against fascism in Germany. There were German people who did stand up against fascists, you know. As an immigrant child, I still see myself in footsteps of these women and men who are also our people that we look up to, even though they look very different to us, even though they didn't speak the language of our parents. Learning across borders about resistance struggles, for example, anti-colonial struggles from Vietnam to Congo to Bolivia, to include that not just in a abstract narrative of some resistance, but as something that we need in an educational practice within the feminist movement, within the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, anti-racist movement. Fighting wars at the moment I think, should be one of the central pillars of what any form of feminism that tries to be progressive should be about. Because on the one hand, we have empathy with refugee families at the moment at the Belarusian borders. And I want to stress my empathy and solidarity is not just for families, women and children, but also for men and also for single men stuck at that border, to open up our vision of who belongs into our community of change. And I think there, I want to stress one point that is connected, and I'm getting to the end, that is connected to questions of class. So as someone who researches in the tradition of historical materialism, historical dialectical materialism, so from a Marxist perspective, I feel that class is mostly reduced to question of classism, of the lived experience of, being poor and being rejected for that and not being included. And I feel that we have to open up an economic conversation on, or this is what I hope for, this is what I would like everyone to engage in, to understand on the one hand, who are the owners of, the big factories and of big business, and not just to look at gender and nationality, etc., but to look into, and this is also something that I can relate to, again, to what Ruth said before, the bigger structures of a capitalist economy that make racisms, sexisms, and all its different forms and facets of heteropatriarchy, etc., necessary, so that now we have laws that are, criminalizing abortion, etc., to understand that behind these laws and institutions, there are economic interests. So personally, in my understanding of intersectionality, be it as a politics on the ground of people who make their hands dirty and get into danger also for that, but also in a theoretical space, I feel that I do treat class differently, not because I believe that we just need a class analysis and this is the grand narrative of socialism, but because I believe that we have to recenter questions on economy, looking at the question of Lebanon, etc. It really made sense for me, but including in that, understanding how class divisions are shaping and developing forms of racism and forms of patriarchal oppression in our everyday experience and also in our practice of community building. And I want to end on the note that I believe that nowadays, the kind of discussion, at least in Europe, that's the space where I'm living at the moment, that I breathe, I feel that many of the intersectionality discussions are tending to calling people out and, saying, oh, you as white women, you cannot speak in this room, etc. Personally, I feel that I want to envision a politics where we can get together because we have a common project, because our multiple identities and life experiences will always divide us. I don't want to have commonality with racist migrant politicians that we have in Germany and in Europe a lot. But I want to find commonalities with people, whatever background it is, how much or little privilege they have, based on a common perspective of what needs to change and how can we do that, learning from each other, because I have a lot to learn from white cis male comrades. I have a lot to learn from Black, trans comrades. I have a lot to learn from everyone, but really to not re-hierarchize, like make that the most oppressed, oppression Olympics are suddenly those that no one can criticize anymore. I feel that this is a sexist and racist politics that is essentializing as if people like us cannot make mistakes. We all have to be held accountable. Let's hold each other accountable. Let's hold each other accountable also in a context of learning from each other, because I think that everyone has something to bring on the table. And that's the feminist, anti-capitalist, transnational movement that I envision.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Eleonora. That was really like a great also wrapping up of kind of almost of this webinar. Thank you for reminding us again, yes, that we shouldn't take immediately for granted that we have so much in common, that when our own identities basically teach us that so much divides us, but going back to what Farah said, what I personally find important, if we really take others actively into account, and if we open up to learn from each other, then that's for me also a kind of intersectional or opening up approach that can lead us out of the binaries and out of the categories and really into a kind of a better world. In this webinar, what we heard, the personal and experiences and the experiences that in insights that you shared with us from the work that you are doing, I'm sure that they were, like for me, definitely eye-opening new elements in this intersectional approach, also eye-opening, very concrete reminders what needs to be done so that we can move on, what needs to be done so that we get out of stereotyping and stigmatizing and just taking stuff for granted, but really moving on from that taking for granted and really making a step forward. I would like to, we have about 10 minutes to go. So I don't know if there's so we have a moment. I would like to ask you, the speakers, and also everybody who is here, does anybody have a very important question to ask, still a comment to share with us, something that you really feel like saying now towards the end of this really very inspiring webinar? Yeah, I can see Vashti's hand. I don't know, let's see anybody else just to have, I can see Vashti. I don't know, Natalia, are there any other questions or, okay, good.
Vashti. For the moment, yeah.
Yes, thank you. Vashti, you have all our ears.
Yes, thank you. So aside from these very rich discussions that we have, I think I forgot to, I mentioned very briefly, but I wanted to highlight how care is also should be part or is part of the discussions that we're having in fifth, in ERA AP, in Youth Coalition, and how we define it as the collective understanding of capability, right? So and I think this happens in the grassroots, and this has been, I think, be part of the work that we do and how work has been redefined and restructured, and how we can imagine ways of working that are caring in solidarity and even working with differences, right? Because coming from a point that, say, for example, just recently we had this so I forgot the term, but it was more of like an anti-racism thing I'm coming from the Philippines, and I don't have experiences of racism in my country, and yet understanding how the acceptance of differences and similarities are very crucial in one's identity. And how do we do that in a manner that is caring and that is informed by the grassroots community, and how we perform consciously and unconsciously the care work, right? And so, yeah, I just want to mention that this is a very critical for me, at least in the works that I do with folks, is how we at least try to ensure that that is part of the discussion and part of the practice that we're doing, because neoliberalism, capitalism, patriarchy, and other forms of oppression does not take that into consideration, right? So it's a great, a form of activism, and I love it, and I love practicing it. So, yeah.
Thank you, Vashti. Definitely, right? The concept of care and basically of the work, what is work and why do we work and who works and who not. I also think it's extremely important also in the discussion that we are carrying on at the moment. And also, so I do hope we'll stay on it and we can include it also in what we're doing. I would like now we are approaching the end of the webinar. So,
Yelena, sorry, there is one question actually that was posted in the chat. It is with regards to the upcoming fourth industrial revolution and question on algorithms and how that is manipulated by big tech. Not sure if this is directed at anyone in particular or if anyone can respond.
I'm sorry, I didn't really get, could you maybe, I cannot see the questions in the chat, but Natalia, could you maybe repeat the two of them? And then I think we leave it to our speakers. If somebody wants to respond, I suggest.
So the question is, how do you see the upcoming fourth industrial revolution with people turning into algorithms manipulated by big tech?
All right, so thank you, Natalia. Does any of our speakers would like to respond? Of course, in the framework or in, I would say, inside of the topic that we're looking at now.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
I'm not the most knowledgeable person on tech or none of that, but we all know right now how big textile corps, but especially tech, are producing a lot of toxic waste and not being accountable for it. And then there's all of these, and it affects a specific kind of people in the world. The people that are disposable are the ones like, while this group of people is benefiting from these so-called technological advancements, others are, stuck behind with the waste that produces and all the negative and health impacting and environmentally damaging aftermath of that. And that is a straightforward result of colonialism, capitalism, and all of that, like disregarding certain human lives, and because they are not regarded as important, because only certain groups are deemed of dignity and fair treatment in the world. Because this, what this system does is to organize us by categories, and you put us in a nice little pyramid, which only the people at the top get treated as human, and below that line, we're subhumans, basically, that deserve or any kind of treatment. It doesn't matter what happens to our communities, our environment, our health. Those are not taken into account because, again, we're below the line of what humanity is. And this is something that was historically constructed through colonialism, and all of the isms that were needed in order to make that system stick to our days, as the shape of neocolonialism, neoliberalism, all that. Like, it's us replicating the same dynamics of power inadvertently or advertently, so depending on your level of consciousness and engagement. So I don't know if this answers any of your questions, but what I can see about it is more abuse, more exploitation of the same people, of the I don't even want to call them natural resources. They're not, because when we talk about resources, we're like commodifying Mother Earth, right? So I try to digress from that kind of language, but yeah, that the same impact is the same thing, because this system wants to perpetuate itself, and it has built strategies and structures to remain as it is. And the solutions that the system brings forward are not really to fix the system. There's a saying in the Dominican Republic that firemen don't step on each other's hoses, or classes don't suicide. That means that the system is never going to act against the system. Meaning that the tools of the master are never going to tear down the house of the master. So to this fourth technological revolution, what I can foresee for my short-lived experience on Earth is that is going to continue to impact negatively in the same people that it usually does, and just to benefit a small group of people that it usually and always benefits.
Thank you, Ruth. And I could see first that Vashti raised her hand. So I would like to maybe just a very short replica to this. I can see also Eleonora would write. We have really 5 minutes, but I think it's worth really keeping on this topic. So Vashti, please tell us.
Yeah, so I would give like a concrete, maybe ways of sharing the experience of the consortium. For example, when we talk the digital space, because for example, maybe also a comment to the big tech, how our digital identities has been used as like a commodity, right? That we are being, that this private information are being sold by big tech to governments, and how this affects marginalized groups of folks, especially refugees, right? Sex workers, LGBTIQ and two-spirited folks, and to anti-gender governments, to very right-wing conservative governments, and even to swerve and turfy movements. And thus, another conversation on digital security and how ensuring that our bodily autonomy extends even in our navigating digital spaces. And I think big tech is not only the problem, our problem is also the way how government marginalizes certain bodies and how it gatekeeps access to internet, not only by poorer people or those who don't have access to internet, but also how they disable certain communities to not access certain safe spaces, especially in a very, I don't want to say backward, but very I would say problematic, anti-gender governments and movements. And so I'll stop there.
Sure. Thank you, Vashti. And Eleonora, I also saw your hand. Are you?
Just very quickly, though I agree with what you said, both of the speakers just now, I also think that there's also a different side to it. So there comes the kind of Hegelian dialectician in me through it. I do believe that there's all these problems with big data and, you know, the era of capitalism we are in at the moment. At the same time, there's also people who are, you know, training hackers for political and social movements, who are also using and trying to imagine what can we do as a society if we can reduce, for example, through intelligence, through technologies, etc., our hours of work, our hours of, you know, housework and all of that. So I think that, just like as a quick reminder, though all of this is true because this potential is in the hands of basically ruling classes who are not working for people but for profit, I believe that if that can change, there's still potential for us to use this for something emancipatory, for being more interconnected, for speaking truth to power, holding people accountable on a different level, as I said, through hackers, etc. So I think that there's also both sides of the coin. I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you very much, Eleonora. And this is very inspiring. I would very much like to thank the person who asked this question. I'm very sorry I couldn't see your name, but thank you very much, because as you can hear, there's a lot into it. Definitely, we need a new webinar. We need a new web seminar, which will be intersectional approach to digitalization. So I can already see it emerging out of our conversation here. And I would really like to ask and invite all of you to stay with us on this topic and really come back to us with this topic so we can really have such a webinar, because there is interest, there is a need really to do it. But before we're there, I would like again to remind all of us that we'll carry on the conversation of today also into the next webinar, which is already set and which is happening on the 30th of November. Let me read to you, which should be, I hope, appearing on the chat. The link, how you can register. The name of the web seminar is Joint Strategies of LGBTQI++ Rights and Feminism. So I would like to invite again everybody to this webinar. And on the last note, to thank everybody who participated today, and especially to thank very much to all our speakers. Thank you, Farah. Thank you, Vashti. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Eleonora. We learned so much from you. Thank you for our organizers and backup people, everybody interpreting who made this possible, this communication that we have. And if I'm allowed, Vashti, if you allow me, I would like to finish this with a word from you, with quoting your colleague from the last webinar who said, you cannot use an old map to explore a new world. So the way I feel it, that by talking together, by doing our work, we are together building and creating this new map to explore a new world. So thank you very much for being with us today. And I do hope we can speak again, work together again, and stay in contact. So thanks, and all have a good day or a good night. Stay well, and I hope we can meet again in a new place. So goodbye for the moment.